Act 2 Minutes Hate. Part 1. The Broadcasts. It started innocently enough. A government-sponsored program called 2 Minutes Hate, broadcast on all major networks aimed at reducing civil unrest. It was a radical initiative, but the unrest had reached critical levels, with protests and riots becoming a daily occurrence. The government claimed it was a psychological strategy designed by top behavioral scientists. The broadcast would feature stories, video clips, and images curated to invoke anger, indignation, and even hate. Frustrations about corruption, inefficiency, and societal injustice were funneled into these 2-minute segments, aired promptly at 11 a.m. and 9 p.m. In a startling show of unity, or perhaps compliance, society embraced the program with open arms. Offices stopped work, students interrupted their learning, and families huddled around the flickering screen at the designated times. Better out than in became the mantra of the masses, a simple phrase that encapsulated the complex emotional release the program seemed to offer. Even the usually divided realms of bars and coffee shops switched from showing sports or playing music to tune in to these volatile 2 minutes. But the 2 Minutes Hate program was not just remarkable for its conceptual audacity, its execution was equally breathtaking. Crafted with a level of psychological and technological finesse, unprecedented in public broadcasting, each segment was a testament to what could be achieved when the most advanced facets of psychology, media studies, and technology were combined. Public squares, community centers, and even churches set up large screens, making it a collective experience that few could avoid, even if they wanted to. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, the societal cracks that 2 Minutes Hate had initially seemed to mend began to deepen in other, more subtle ways. An underbelly of intellectuals, artists, and even some politicians questioned the ethical implications. Though societal unrest had decreased, according to government statistics, healthcare providers began to report a surge in mental health issues, such as depression, anxiety, and insomnia. The program's critics argued that, while we might be quelling one form of social unrest, we were potentially sowing the seeds for a host of new psychological problems. For me, the daily ritual grew increasingly complex. It provided a predictable space for emotional catharsis, yet it also became a gnawing source of internal conflict. As the clock ticked closer to 11 a.m. or 9 p.m., I felt both an inexplicable pull toward the screen and an unsettling sense of apprehension. Was this collective emotional purge truly therapeutic, or was it a form of mass manipulation designed to distract us from addressing the root causes of our societal woes? And so, as each new broadcast loomed, these questions weighed heavy on my mind, yet remained unanswered. What started as a simple psychological experiment had grown into a national phenomenon, a part of our collective identity. But as the line between emotional release and emotional manipulation began to blur, one couldn't help but wonder, were we solving our society's deepest problems, or merely plastering over them with a veneer of orchestrated, collective catharsis? Months turned into a year, and the 2 Minutes Hate had become a deeply ingrained societal norm. Government reports gloated about the decline in violent crimes and civil unrest, attributing this miracle to their groundbreaking initiative. Some schools even began to incorporate the program into their curriculum, discussing the featured topics in classes to encourage critical thinking. Companies started to advertise their products during the 2 minutes calm, a 60-second period of soothing imagery and music that immediately followed the intense 2-minute broadcasts. It was a whole new economy, a new form of social engagement, all revolving around these snippets of officially sanctioned emotional release. But as the program's influence broadened, so did the scale and scope of its criticism. Renowned psychologists from around the world started publishing papers and studies that questioned the long-term impact of routine exposure to such intense negative emotions. Human rights organizations raised ethical concerns, citing the potential misuse of the program for propaganda or political gain. A new generation of artists and musicians used their platforms to create counter-narratives, Their works questioned whether these 2 minutes of fury were actually pacifying the public, or blunting their critical faculties, making them more docile and less prone to challenge the status quo. An underground movement, known only as 2 Minutes Peace, also started to gain traction. This clandestine group hacked into local broadcasts to air their own versions of the program, featuring messages of unity, love, and compassion. While the government was quick to crack down on these unauthorized disruptions, they couldn't completely silence the growing doubts among the populace. It was during this period of growing skepticism that I too found myself in a moral quandary. The doubts I'd always had were now amplified, not just by my own thoughts, but by the voices of dissent that had become too loud to ignore. I found myself increasingly drawn to literature and discussions that questioned the very foundations of 2 minutes hate. Was it ethical to manipulate human emotions on such a massive scale? Could a society that outsourced its emotional regulation to a 2-minute broadcast truly call itself free? Moreover, the supposed benefits of the program began to seem less clear-cut. Conversations with friends and family revealed that many were experiencing what could only be described as emotional fatigue. The initial catharsis of the first few months had given way to a sense of emotional emptiness. We were all shouting, but was anyone really listening? Were we actually addressing the underlying issues that had led to this state of civil unrest? Or were we merely shouting into a void, placated by the illusion of action and unity? As the clock struck 11 a.m. and 9 p.m. each day, the dichotomy between the program's public success and its private impact became increasingly hard to ignore. Houses, offices, and public spaces still tuned in religiously, but the atmosphere had changed. What was once a collective outpour of emotion now felt like a choreographed dance, a ritual devoid of the spirit that once animated it. And so, as society stood at this crossroads, a debate began to unfold that touched on issues far deeper than 2-minute broadcasts. It was a debate about the role of government in regulating emotion, about the ethical limits of psychological manipulation, and about the kind of society we wanted to be. As the second anniversary of 2 Minutes Hate approached, it was clear that a moment of reckoning was at hand, one that would require us to confront not just the program itself, but the very values and principles that had allowed it to flourish. Part 2. The Anomaly. Every day, like clockwork, at 11 a.m. and 9 p.m., I'd prepare for the inevitable emotional upheaval, a twisted form of catharsis delivered through pixels and sound waves. As the clock's hand ticked closer to the hour, I'd feel a mix of dread and excitement stir within me. I'd move to the living room and take deliberate steps to draw the curtains close-in, their fabric brushing softly against the windowsill. The room would darken, the dimness serving as a form of sensory deprivation, as if to heighten the experience that was about to unfold. I'd sink into my couch, its cushions molded to my form from countless prior viewings. The material was slightly worn, but comforting in its familiarity. My fingers would instinctively find their way to the armrests, gripping them as if bracing for a physical impact. I'd focus on the screen, my eyes narrowing, and my breath slowing down in anticipation of the onslaught of imagery and sound designed to stoke my deepest angers and fears. But about a week ago, the ritual took a nightmarish turn. I was midway through a sip of coffee when I saw it, a flicker, a frame that was jarringly out of place. The disruption was so quick that if you blinked, you'd miss it. But the image it conveyed was so deeply disturbing that it seared into my consciousness. A face, grotesque and aberrant, flashed onto the screen. It seemed to defy categorization, neither human nor animal, but an unsettling amalgam of both. Its eyes were abnormally large, gaping voids that felt like they could suck you in, like miniature black holes trying to absorb all light and hope. Its mouth twisted into an ambiguous expression, either a scream of torment or a laugh of deranged glee. The image was so disturbing that a shiver ran down my spine, causing me to spill my coffee. Gasping, I grabbed the remote and rewound the broadcast. My finger hovered over the play button, hesitating for a moment before pressing it. As the frames rolled back, the face was nowhere to be seen. It had vanished, leaving me to question my sanity. Could it have been a glitch? A stray, corrupted frame, perhaps? I tried to brush it off as a technical hiccup, but the image stayed with me, lurking in the periphery of my thoughts. However, the anomaly was far from a one-time occurrence. It happened again during the next session, and then again, each time lingering just a fraction of a second longer. It was as if the entity was growing bolder, revealing more of its dreadful visage with each appearance. I could see its features in increasingly horrifying detail, veins that appeared to pulsate, a texture that seemed disturbingly organic. It wasn't a mere glitch. It was a deliberate intrusion, a malevolent entity that had managed to weave itself into the very fabric of the broadcast. My life began to unravel. Work became an afterthought. I'd sit at my desk, unable to focus, my mind drifting back to those horrific frames. Friends and family started to worry. Calls went unanswered, messages ignored. All that mattered was identifying this intruder. I recorded every session, playing them back frame by frame, eyes squinting in the darkness as I searched for the face. And each time I found it, its features appeared clearer, its malevolence more palpable. I'd capture screenshots, analyzing them with a mix of dread and obsession, trying to extract some meaning, some explanation for its existence. As days turned into a week, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that the anomaly was more than just a broadcast glitch. It was a harbinger of something dark and unknown. The emotional storm that 2 Minutes Hate used to bring now turned into a constant drizzle of unease that refused to let up. Something was terribly wrong, and the haunting intuition inside me knew that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Part 3. The investigation continued. The confirmation from others online was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it confirmed that I wasn't losing my mind. On the other, it signaled that the phenomenon was more widespread than I initially thought. This raised alarming questions. Was this limited to my city, my country, or was it a global event? How many people had seen the face but chose not to speak out, dismissing it as a glitch or a figment of their imagination? My private outreach to fellow witnesses yielded unsettling results. Conversations unfolded in whispers, in DMs and private chat rooms, away from the prying eyes of the public forum. It was as if we were all afraid that speaking openly about the face would invite more dire consequences. See No Evil 42, the woman whose cousin worked in broadcasting, updated me with concerning news. Her cousin was not only transferred but had been placed on an indefinite administrative leave. Worse, he reported that his own home's electronics had begun to act erratically, TVs turning on and off, radio channels switching inexplicably, and his phone rebooting at random times. She was convinced these were not coincidences. They were warnings. Another user, who went by the username Dark Matter, claimed to be an audio engineer and had also noticed odd spikes in the audio frequencies during the broadcasts. According to his analysis, the shrieking sound emitted by the face was a combination of multiple layers of noise, including subsonic and ultrasonic frequencies. Frequencies that human ears couldn't detect, but might have effects on both human physiology and animal behavior. This seemed to corroborate the reports of pets acting strangely. Taking this one step further, I began digging into scientific literature about the psychological and physiological effects of audio frequencies on living beings. There were studies that proved how specific frequencies could induce feelings of dread, anxiety, and even nausea. If the image was not disturbing enough, the embedded sounds were designed to amplify the emotional impact on the audience. We were being affected on multiple sensory levels, leading to a full-blown psychological event. An even more alarming response came from retired Eagle, the retired military intelligence officer. After our meeting, he used his contacts to dig further into the matter. A friend in the Department of Defense hinted off record that there had been a surge in internal memos warning of potential cyber attacks, targeting media infrastructure. When pressed for more details, however, the friend became reticent and cautioned retired Eagle not to pursue this line of inquiry any further. Another development added a further layer of mystery. A group of independent hackers claimed they tried to trace the source of the broadcast intrusion. They reported that the tracking efforts led them to a series of dead ends, bouncing between servers located in multiple countries. It was as if the intrusion was coming from everywhere and nowhere, simultaneously. The clues were adding up to something almost too horrendous to contemplate. The complexity, the sophistication, and the psychological manipulation involved pointed to an entity, or entities, operating at an unprecedented level of expertise. It became evident that this was not just a series of random events or anomalies. There was intent behind them, and the intent was gradually revealing itself to be malevolent in nature. As the number of days and episodes of 2 Minutes Hate continued to roll on, it felt like the world around me was becoming increasingly unstable, like the fabric of reality itself was unraveling. And at the center of this cosmic unraveling was that face, that terrible, malevolent face, its intent becoming clearer with each passing day, to sow discord, feed off collective hate, and usher in something far worse. Part 4. Decoding the message continued. The decoded message and those haunting audio whispers had become an all-consuming enigma, a puzzle that demanded to be solved, but defied easy interpretation. My small circle of collaborators, each of us from different walks of life but united by our skepticism of 2 Minutes Hate, were at odds on what to make of it. Some argued it might be a hacktivist ploy, a digital Trojan horse designed to expose the dangers of mass emotional manipulation. Others, however, harbored far darker speculations. They suggested the mysterious message could be an open invitation, not from activists but from entities residing in the shadowy crevices of our understanding, reaching out to use for purposes we could only guess at. Given the unfathomable complexity of the decoded message and the metaphysical implications it carried, I knew I needed specialized help. Thus, I found myself reaching out to Dr. Sarah Lenton, an expert whose background was as eclectic as it was intriguing. Her academic interests spanned from semiotics, the study of signs and symbols, to cryptozoology and folklore. I sent her an email detailing my disturbing findings and was greeted with an unexpectedly prompt invitation to her office. When I met her, she emanated an air of curiosity mixed with caution, as if she too had glimpsed the edge of something frightening, yet irresistibly compelling. She listened intently as I recounted my experiences, occasionally nodding as if some pieces were falling into place in a puzzle only she could see. Her explanation turned the lens of this inquiry from the merely unsettling to the downright horrifying. She spoke of entities woven into the fabric of ancient myths and contemporary folklore, entities that fed not on organic matter, but on the psychic energy generated by human emotions. These were parasitic beings, dwelling in some indeterminate plane of existence, but reaching into our world to draw sustenance from our fears, our angers, and our hates. "You see," she said, leaning back in her chair and narrowing her eyes as if trying to focus on some distant point. "Symbols, messages, and encoded data could be ways these entities manipulate our plane of existence. Think of it as a footprint or a Ripley effect. Their true form might be incomprehensible to use, but the manifestations could be observed and decoded." I shivered at her words, the temperature in the room seeming to drop a few degrees. "But to what end?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Is this feeding a form of sustenance, or does it serve a more malevolent purpose?" "That's the billion-dollar question," she responded. "It could simply be a cycle of life for these entities, a parasitic relationship with humans being an existential necessity. On the other hand," her gaze intensified, "this harvesting of hate might be a catalytic process, accumulating energy for an event or transformation of apocalyptic proportions. Either way, understanding the intent could be vital for not just us as individuals, but potentially for humanity as a whole." The weight of her words settled over me like a shroud, and in that moment, it was clear that we had pierced through a veil of mundane reality into a realm of cosmic horror. This entity, or entities, had not just infiltrated the broadcasts, they had potentially infiltrated the psychic fabric of society itself, and whether they were simply parasites or harbingers of some greater calamity, their intrusion represented a corruption of our collective soul, exploiting our worst impulses for ends we could only begin to imagine. And so, with a newfound sense of urgency and the uneasy alliance of skeptics and experts alike, we committed ourselves to understanding this nefarious phenomenon. The next phase of our investigation would require deeper research into esoteric lore, digital forensics, and perhaps even experiments to probe the boundary between our world and whatever realm these entities called home. But most unsettling of all was the realization that the clock was ticking, that every broadcast of 2 minutes hate might be a step closer to some unfathomable awakening or catastrophe. Dr. Lenton looked at me, a mixture of fear and determination in her eyes, as if to say that though the path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, it was one we had no choice but to tread. With a sense of grim resolve, I nodded. Our venture into the unknown had only just begun, and we were now playing a high-stakes game against forces that defied understanding. There would be no turning back. As the night descended, a sense of foreboding gripped me. Still pondering Dr. Lenton's unsettling theories, I sat in my apartment, staring at the screen as the clock ticked closer to the hour of the next 2 minutes hate broadcast. What happened next defied logic and shattered my already fractured sense of reality. The broadcast began as it always had, with a flickering image of the face that had come to symbolize a visceral, nameless rage. But this time the screen sputtered, blurred, and then went to static. When the image returned, it was unlike anything I had seen before. The face filled the screen entirely, and a sinister caption materialized below. "I am here." The lights in my apartment flickered as if in response, and then died, plunging everything into an inky darkness. A sense of primal fear gripped me. Hands trembling, I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight function. When the beam of light finally pierced the suffocating blackness, what I saw made my heart grind to a halt. The face had transcended the boundaries of the screen and now hung in the air of my living room, materialized as a nightmarish floating mask. A surge of emotions roiled within me: anger, revulsion, and above all, an overwhelming sense of dread. As if in tune with my heightened emotional state, the contours of the face twisted into a grotesque semblance of a grin. It was a horrifying realization. The entity was gorging itself on my emotional outpouring. In a desperate, near-instinctual act of defiance, I hurled my phone at this loathsome manifestation. A garbled scream, equal parts laughter and agony, erupted from the entity, filling the room with an otherworldly cacophony. To my astonishment, the face disintegrated, vanishing into a wisp of shadow and mist, leaving only the fading echoes of its shriek. Seconds later, the lights flickered back to life. My TV screen displayed a message indicating the end of the broadcast. Yet, for the first time since this nightmarish saga began, the oppressive feeling of dread that had haunted me lifted, replaced by an uneasy tranquility. Could it be that my act of defiance had wounded this parasitic entity? Perhaps, by resisting its emotional harvest, I had starved it, disrupting the feeding process that sustained its malevolent existence. One thing was clear: this battle between humans and the entities feeding off their darkest emotions was no longer confined to the realm of legend and folklore. It was real, and it was happening here and now. As I sat there contemplating the terrifying but empowering experience, I realized the gravity of the path that lay ahead. The entity had manifested, breaking through the boundaries of its own dimension to reach into ours. But had it retreated because it was weakened, or was this just another move in a far more complicated and dangerous game? Either way, I now had something that I hadn't had before. A glimmer of hope. Hope that we could defend ourselves, hope that we could gain an understanding of these entities, and hope that we could counteract the malevolent forces that sought to feed off our darkest impulses. But there was also an added weight of responsibility. I knew that I had to share this experience with Dr. Lenton and my collaborators. If a confrontation was coming, we would need to prepare, armed with knowledge and fortified by the understanding that we were not as powerless as we might have believed. As I reached for another device to contact Dr. Lenton, my phone, after all, had served its purpose in a more physical way than I'd ever intended. I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that this was merely a skirmish in a much longer, darker conflict. What had manifested in my living room was a harbinger, a chilling preview of a struggle that humanity, knowingly or not, was already deeply embroiled in. There was no turning back. The entity had declared its presence in the most personal way possible. And as terrifying as it was, the manifestation had revealed something crucial. The entities were not invulnerable. They could be hurt, even if temporarily. And in a world suddenly overflowing with darkness and enigmas, that small flicker of possibility felt like a beacon in the night. Part 5. The Aftermath. Within moments of the entity's disappearance, power returned to my apartment, and the television resumed its regular programming, as if mocking the gravity of what had just unfolded. There was an unsettling incongruity between the everyday mundanity on the screen and the extraordinary horror I had just witnessed. It was as though reality itself was gaslighting me. Compelled to find out whether others had experienced similar phenomena, I immediately plunged back into the labyrinthine depths of online forums and social media. What I discovered was simultaneously relieving and terrifying. I was not alone. Others had been visited by the entity now being collectively referred to as the Smiling Man. More chillingly, reports were surfacing of people going missing after such encounters, leaving behind only a haunting emptiness and a myriad of unanswered questions. Within a single day, the government declared an abrupt cessation of the 2 Minutes Hate program, citing vague technical reasons. No mention was made of the unusual occurrences or the increasing reports of missing persons. It was a silence that screamed volumes, drowning out the cacophony of speculative chatter that had erupted online. The government's deliberate vagueness felt like an ominous sign. Either they didn't know what was going on, which was terrifying in its own right, or they did know and chose not to say, which was arguably worse. Now, as I sit in the strange quiet of my living room, I can't escape the feeling that the Smiling Man hasn't withdrawn entirely. I sense it lurking in the hidden recesses of our digital lives, in the invisible wavelengths of our broadcasts, and the coded language of our media. It thrives in those spaces, nourished by the raw emotional energy of our collective anger, fear, and hate. So I issue this warning to you. Should you ever find yourself before a television program, a social media feed, or any media designed to incite anger within you, turn it off immediately. Engaging with it feeds into a cycle much darker than we can imagine. Our hate is not just a storm of human emotion. It is a banquet for entities that exist beyond the veil of our understanding. As for me, the battle continues. I've established contact with Dr. Lenton and others who are committed to understanding and combating these psychic parasites. We are pooling our resources, knowledge and experiences in the hope of finding a way to protect ourselves and perhaps rid our reality of these malevolent entities once and for all. But it's a race against time. For the more we hate, the stronger they get. What we're dealing with here isn't just a threat to individual psyches, but a challenge to the fabric of our society and, possibly, to the nature of reality itself. While we may not fully understand the forces we're up against, there's one thing we know. Emotions are a source of great power, and if we're not careful, they could also be our downfall. We must strive for understanding, for unity, and most importantly, to deprive these entities of the nourishment they seek, our darkest, most destructive impulses. In the end, I'm left with an unsettling paradox. My exposure to the Smiling Man has shown me the horrific potential that lies hidden within the underbelly of human emotion, but it has also illuminated something else, a capacity for defiance, a glimmer of hope. We are not powerless. We can choose to break the cycle, but to do that, we must first acknowledge the darkness, both within ourselves and in the spaces between our world and others. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the clock is ticking. And so, as I navigate this uncharted territory, armed with nothing but my resolve and a fragile coalition of like-minded souls, I can't shake the feeling that I'm playing a dangerous game. A game whose rules I don't fully understand, but whose consequences could be unimaginably dire. And yet, despite it all, I continue, propelled by the very human belief that, against all odds, we can make a difference.